All right. Hello. Gonna wait a few more minutes for folks. All right. So there's just one person right now. I'll give it one more minute and then I'll get going. And if it just be one, hello. If it just be one, I will lecture for that one. Or two. All right. Or three, huzzah. Okay. So, hello. Today, what we are going to talk about is camera shots and film language. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this today, even though it's something that could have certainly helped with storyboarding, I want to revisit it for since if you recall, your final project is a animatic. So this is a good time to really think about, because you are going to basically be building a animated version of like a storyboard. If you recall, that's what an animatic is. To really start thinking about the film language that you're going to use in your shots. So today we're going to go over those shots. We're going to talk about cinematography. We're going to talk about continuity among shots. We're going to talk about a few different types of shots, different types of transitions and camera moves, and we're also going to talk a bit about staging. Now, I will say that a lot of this content is also in your ideas for the animated short textbook, specifically in, let me get my copy, specifically in chapters 8 and 9. So, I would make sure that you follow up with a lot of that content so that you have, again, a little deeper dive than a lecture can go through. An hour-long lecture can go through. So let's get going. So the first thing that I want to make sure you understand is what an animatic is. So an animatic is, like I said, a sort of videoized version of a storyboard. And the reason you do animatics is to take that information you have in your storyboard. You might set it to the soundtrack of your movie if you already have like music and even some like dialogue recorded. But you'll set that to your movie, or you'll set it to your music, and you make the shots change where you want them to change. And the idea of this is that it's almost like you're pre-visualizing your movie without doing the actual like work of the animation. So what's on the left here is the animatic, and what's on the right is the animation. So this one's a more like complex one, but you can see there's still like a fair amount of storyboard-esque things going on here, and you can even see like the pen sizes and weights change from shot to shot. And part of that is because, again, it's just like sketchy. It's not finalized. It's not fully animated. It's representational shots. And what you're trying to get at with this is a sense of, what the shots and motion of the scene are going to be, what the timing of the scene is. Not so much the timing of the animation, like a little bit of timing of animation in broad general terms, but often just the timing of like when the camera transitions from one shot to the next. And this one you can see as well, there is even a like masked over wipe of the books falling like right there. And that again, that gives you a sense of like when things are going to occur in your animation. So this is your chance to really exercise the film grammar part of this. So we've mainly been working on the actual like buildup of animation, the like sitting down and getting character motion to read really well. And now we're going to focus a lot on the like film grammar of what it is you're building. So if you recall, basic film grammar it's useful to think of like a film as an essay or a paper or a story. If you think of a frame as a single image, and it's like a letter in your, a single letter on your essay. A shot is a continuous recording made by a camera. It's analogous to a word. Now a shot is like if you were having a scene where two characters were talking, and for a few seconds the camera was focused on a character while they spoke. That's the shot. The scene is the whole scene of their dialogue. That is the scene, and that is your sentence. So it's your like one of the bigger building blocks of your whole story. And then the sequence, so for a sequence, think of like a battle. You'd hear it like called a battle scene, but it's really a battle sequence. So like and Star Wars is going to come up a few times in here, but if you're watching The Empire Strikes Back, the Battle of Hoth is a sequence because it's a series of scenes which together tell a major part of an entire story. So everything that happens in the Battle of Hoth, inside the base, outside the base, in the snowspeeders, in the AT-ATs, on the battlefield, all of those are different scenes that like come together to create the sequence known as the Battle of Hoth. So that's like a paragraph, and again, in your overall like essay that is a story. All of this, of course, is cinematography, which is the camera work of filmmaking. And camera work is an incredibly important part of filmic storytelling. So, a movie that's credited with like really starting to push the boundaries of cinematography as a storytelling medium is the film Citizen Kane from 1941. So here we have a scene where, little Kane's mother, she inherits some money from like a coal mine, and she wants to send her son to live with this banker in the big city so that he'll have a great future. And so you have the mother and the banker on the right side of the frame, and they're closer to us, they're in the foreground, and then the father is more farther away, a little more towards the background. And, we've seen this before in our lecture materials. We've seen this as like, how do you create the sense that one character is fighting a group of other characters, and isolating being isolated from those other characters, you can do it by having some characters more towards the foreground and more towards the background. So you see that, like, the different parts of this conflict are on either side of the frame. And then little Kane himself, Orson Welles' character as a kid, is in the middle, playing outside in the snow with a sled, spoiler alert, called Rosebud. And the sled, like, the window frames him in such a way that, it indicates, like, this is who we are discussing. We're essentially fighting over this boy. So that that sets up, like, the stakes of the scene in a way. And having this gives you a context of, like, who are the players in this scene and what is the conflict of the scene. So, that is like how cinematography can be used to tell a story. And it's different in how you would tell a story in a novel, or even in some comic books. What's important to know is that each method of each medium that we do look at, has its own advantages and disadvantages. And that's not to say one is better or worse than any other. It's that they each have, like, superpowers that make them unique. So games have interactivity and the ability for players to sort of define their own path. And they have the ability to build empathy and other things through that. Film have this sort of, like, cinematography and authorial intent and timing and pacing. Comics have the ability to control space and time through their graphic layouts, right? So, you can, like, investigate a comic in a way that you can't with a movie. And that's, like, famously why Alan Moore didn't want The Watchmen to be adapted as a movie, because, like, he preferred you to be able to, like, cozy up with the book and sort of dive into it. And then likewise a novel can do different things. So, each of these mediums has their own powers and limitations, but cinematography is a main part of film and animation, because we can tell a story by, like, having different elements of a shot played off of one another. Before moving on, ask me 2 questions. How long does it take to usually go from animatic to animated short? I don't really know. Animated short is certainly the biggest part of just, like, the legwork of executing the movie, because that's where you're doing all the drawings and such. So I guess the right answer would be it depends largely on how you're producing it. Is it, like, hand animated or CG? Is it you said short, but so I guess the right answer would be it depends on, like, the production realities of it, really. What would you say is a game or animation that handles cinematography excellently? Somebody asked me that in the last lecture. I said a cartoon series that we'd been watching in our house that has really good cinematography has been Hilda on Netflix. I like that a lot. I'm a big fan of that. Games that handle cinematography excellently. I think the Prince of Persia, like the old Prince of Persia from 1989, actually has a really good sense of cinematography. the game Another World, which is an old PC game, has a really good sense of cinematography. Metroid Fusion does a lot with, it almost creates like a Hitchcockian atmosphere. Maybe not Hitchcock, but I mean, the way it uses side-scrolling but thinks about it as like a camera angle, I think is really fascinating. So I would say some of those. Games that I think I wouldn't necessarily call it cinematography, but games that do direct your view really well. I think Valve does a good job building that in. I mean, there's a lot of games that do a really good job directing your viewpoint. So yeah. Like I'm glad you brought up games in particular too, because cinematography in games, like this is one reason that, for example, Roger Ebert said like games can't be art, is because you've given. It's not surprising that comes from like a film person, because you're essentially giving the player the camera. I disagree, to be clear, for a lot of reasons that are outside the scope of this lecture, but. The onus is like, even though you're giving the player the camera, the onus is on you to direct your action through almost like environment design and level design in such a way that you are directing the player's eye. I mean, a level designer is almost like an architect in that way, because architecture is art, but it's not. And it guides your eye in the way a shot in a film would, but it has to do it without the, I guess, luxury of being able to direct an architect doesn't hold the occupant's head and be like, you must look at that window. That's a luxury I think filmmakers have, where game people, we have to do that through environmental composition such that the person is compelled visually, because we understand what makes humans react, to see like what we want them to see in the world. Am I crazy, or is there a tiny little guy? Oh my goodness, there is. You're right. I wonder if that's like the film website that I got this from's watermark. In case you can't tell, I had to screen cap this from Google. So I use Firefox as my browser, and for some reason Firefox, if you try to copy and paste too many images from it, you have to like, it won't let you do it, and then I have to resort to screen capping. So that's why it has some watermarky things from Google image search. That's funny. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up cinematography in games, because we have it, and it's useful to know it, but you employ it in a very different way. So thank you for asking for that. I've actually written like whole book chapter sections on this. So building continuity between your scenes. So the last class, there was a question about like how many shots is too many shots, and I don't think there's too many shots. At least by my understanding, there's not too many shots. I also don't do this type of animation. I do mostly game animation, which is contextualized very differently. But my understanding is that within reason, there are not too many shots. But I mean, unless you are going like every word or syllable changes the shot, that would be ridiculous. But I think what's more important is that your shots have some sort of continuity to them, which is the flow and consistency of images. So for example, like this series of shots is, a scene where a guy is exploring a haunted house. So he goes into the house, and the way that the scenes are laid, or the shots are laid out, is that he is always on the right side of the shot, and his motion always goes from right to left. Except in shot 3, where they have him get to the top of the staircase and then go from left to right, and that's why it's rejected, because it breaks that continuity. I would say, given the scene, it's not the worst sin ever, but it is a little muddier than you might have otherwise. You could accomplish this same, like if you wanted to show him getting to the top of the stairs, you could accomplish it with a different shot. Maybe coming from the position of the door towards the top of the staircase so that he reaches the top of the stairs but is still going from right to left. You want to have those things consistent because you want the you want to create that visual continuity. So things you want to keep away from is objects or characters that seem to come out of nowhere. You don't want to have a character just suddenly be in a scene. You want things to be consistent throughout the scene, and if something is introduced, you want it to be introduced in a way that the audience is prepared for it. You don't want to have sudden direction changes, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And you don't want to have sudden lighting changes. Now, consistency, you're probably thinking, well, what about this movie I saw and that movie I saw? And in all likelihood, what you're getting into is a bunch of the different shots that we're actually going to look at and that embrace playing with continuity and playing with how scenes and bits of a story are mushed against each other. And a lot of them break these sort of very typical rules. But in breaking them, they set up your expectation that these cuts will exist. And all of these cuts are techniques that, these continuity rules almost exist from the beginning of filmmaking, and then all of these different types of shots exist since filmmaking has evolved as a storytelling medium, but the way that they are presented to you is done in such a way that it's almost like anticipation in animation. If you're going to do something, you need to telegraph to the audience it's about to happen, otherwise they won't know what's going on. So you can break what seems like these continuity, you can do what seems like breaking these continuity rules, but if you couch it in a certain way, the audience will get it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the biggest ones, and even this is not broken when you do different types of shots, is the 180-degree rule, which is if you have multiple characters in a scene, you typically want to keep them where they are in the frame consistent from shot to shot. And that allows you to, again, keep the scene consistent and readable. So, your textbook uses the example of a frog and an armadillo playing tug of war. And if you switch who is on the right side of the frame and who's on the left side of the frame, especially since these characters have kind of similar silhouettes, you can really break the audience's understanding of the scene. So the 180-degree rule says that in a very simple version, if a character is on the left side of your frame, but in all of your shots in that scene, they should always be on the left side of your frame. In a more technical sense, and the way that you would probably employ it within a 3D scene, look at the bottom diagram, you don't want to break the 180-degree line. So all of your cameras for your different shots should be at the angles that you'd want them all on one side of the characters, kind of like what you have in that image on the bottom of this slide. If you were to have one above, on the other side of the characters, that would break the 180-degree rule, and that would put the armadillo on the right and the frog on the left, as opposed to the armadillo on the left and the frog on the right. So now if you were to take the middle image and literally do a Photoshop edit, flip horizontal, you'd fix it. So that's the thing about this rule is it's mostly where your camera is, and why it's important to you could be anywhere on that one side as long as you don't break the other side. And the way that you can think about this is if you look at this set of frames with this conversation between these two characters, the shot changes, and the shot changes based on like such that one character is in the foreground and one character is in the background in different shots. And the reason that that's not confusing is that the older man is always on the left and the younger man is always on the right. And they don't break that 180 degree rule, even though over the course of the dialogue, the characters are the subject of the frame in different frames. Other things that help you make the story easier to understand is avoiding disjointed shots. You want to have clear transitions between locations. So like if a character is walking down the street, you don't want to suddenly cut to them in a car, right? You'd want to have something where like it shows them getting into their car or being dragged into the car or, somehow getting into the car. That would, if you didn't do that, that would give you the impression of like a skipping DVD. And, obviously there are reasons to break these rules, but breaking these rules are things that you'd want to have like embedded in your story where like maybe the person has some sort of like dissociative time skipping situation going on with their brain, and that's like maybe the problem is that they suddenly like they're doing one thing and then suddenly it's 1964 and then suddenly it's 1987 and what the heck happened, maybe not quite to that extreme, but you can kind of like that's a part of your story, but that's the only time you'd want to do something like that. You want to avoid like more mundane how did we get there situations. So okay, before moving on, somebody asked me a question about this. Okay, let's say you're working in a scene in a comic and you need to introduce a new character to the scene. What do you think would be the best method for doing this? I don't know. It depends on your story, I guess. Like, I really couldn't tell you. I mean, I guess that's more of a storytelling question than... yeah, it's like more of a creative storytelling question that I don't think is easily given like a textbook answer, I guess. If the characters are sitting around chatting, maybe then you have like, oh, here's my friend, and then the character walks into the frame, or if it's a fight scene, it's like, who's that coming over the hill, and then it's like, oh man, it's so-and-so here to save me, or I'm here to save you. But I mean, I guess that it's depending on your story. So, yeah. But again, like, in case you haven't guessed, most of... I will say this. I think that... if you are used to very objective things like, in, for example, math or engineering or science, for this field, you really, you almost need to like totally throw that out the window. There's not a whole lot of there's things that are written down and are guidelines, like the 12 principles of animation or these things with shots. that are rules, but rules can certainly, there's like caveats to all of them. So, I'm asked a lot of questions about like, well, what's the best way to do this? And it's like, there's not an answer to that. There's ways to introduce characters well, but there isn't like a textbook. Oh, well, if you have a character enter a door approximately 8 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, and the door is green, that is the best way. There's no like objective to that. But that goes for everything. There's not like a one set objective way to do anything in this field. You just kind of have to, follow guidelines for the storytelling, but sometimes those guidelines, by mastering them, you can also find clever ways to break them. But it really depends on your, I guess, artistic intentionality. And what you're trying to accomplish with the entrance of the character. So I know that's not the answer you're looking for, but that's like the answer, is that there's not really an answer except your own intent and some guidelines like this to make it not confusing. So shots. We've talked about shots. We've talked about shots in like a very general way of that, like, there are shots, and shots give you, based on like where the character or the subject is in relationship with the camera, what that can create. Same thing with like how the character is situated in the shot, and how characters are framed. But let's look at a few, again, sort of like guideline shots, or shots that are popular such that they give you a sense of like how you can build a scene. And again, like, there are rules of this, but they're not all like set in stone. But shots that are common and are sort of tropes include the establishing shot, which is a shot usually at the opening of a scene, which gives a general information about the scene. So this is an establishing shot of two characters having dinner together in the movie The Grand Budapest Hotel, and it tells you a lot about the scene. It tells you what kind of room they're in. It tells you who is at this dinner, and it's a very small number of people, so they're in this very big empty space. It tells you about how the hotel is not well visited, and it contains a lot of information about the scene. If we're looking at the movie Skyfall, this is an interesting establishing shot because it both establishes the locale, but also provides this really interesting contrast between Bond's Aston Martin, but then his like ancestral home in Scotland. So it's this sort of like juxtaposition between this like very urban sophistication and country, old world country, rural. Establishing shots does not have to be like a shot of an exterior of a building. It can be a shot of a room full of characters, but the idea is that it establishes who is in the room and who is where. So that's what you do with establishing shots. Another type of shot is the reverse shot, or over the shoulder. So this is like conversation dialogue shots, and it's a shot that points the camera at the opposite direction of the previous shot, and it's used in dialogue. But this is a shot that when you hear about it, you're like, but wouldn't that break the 180-degree rule? And the point is that if you are following the 180-degree rule, it actually sets these shots up well, because you are going back and forth, but by maintaining something like one character is, like the older character in this scene is always on the left side of the frame, you can make what would otherwise be a disorienting transition very easy to read, because the character is always staying in the same position. So that's an important caveat to this rule, is that you're not just wildly transitioning back and forth. You are doing so in an organized fashion that all the players in the scene are you're able to keep track of them. And again, you might do something like if you see the first shot in frame 1, that is your establishing shot of the scene, is that these two men are at a table, and then you zoom in on them, and you see you do the reverse shots back and forth. A POV shot, or a point of view shot, is a shot from the point of view of a character. It's used to show the audience what a character is looking at. So this is a shot from the baby's point of view in the movie Raising Arizona. You see these, like Quentin Tarantino always throws in what's called the trunk shot, which is a point of view shot from inside the trunk of a car, as seen by a character who has been captured and thrown into the trunk of a car. And it's not just like, characters in weak positions looking up. There's lots of other types of, iterations on this. But a point of view shot is generally like if you want something to be from the point of view of a character. And that can be useful in like if a character is being chased, if a character is being, followed or something like that. It can be useful for tension or for other things. Reaction shot. And the book points out that this is a shot often overlooked by beginners, but it is an important tool for acting and animation, which is, just instead of only showing the action of a scene, take a shot to show your character's reaction to it. So don't try to stuff the character's reaction in the scene, in the action of the scene itself. It's okay, and it makes the reaction easier to read if you spend a shot focusing just on the character's reaction. And again, the normal type of reaction shot usually has some sort of action and then the characters react. But for example, one of the more famous reaction shots in like film history is this one from Jurassic Park, where the reaction shot comes first and then you see what the characters are reacting to, and that's highly effective. So you can break the typical pattern of the reaction shot. And to the question about like how do you introduce a new character, maybe here's an idea. Characters react, or here's an interesting one. Again, I don't know what your story is, but the characters are reacting, and you're like kind of built up and hyped up for like what they're reacting to, and then you see brontosauruses. And that is a really awesome moment in that movie. So, that's another way you can introduce things, by turning the normal reaction shot of like action, reaction into reaction to hype up action. So that's another, that's a tool that can be really useful. So how do you transition between scenes? Or shots. So multiple views are a powerful storytelling tool, as you can see. Being able to go back and forth between shots lets you focus the viewer's attention, lets you do really cool inventive stuff. And how do we, if you've ever been in a class where I have you write a paper, you'll hear me usually say that, your content's important, but the thing that really makes your paper sing is the way you transition between topics. That can be true of film and animation as well. And scene transitions are really important, and they're one of the things that make this type of storytelling really unique in film and animation. Again, because in other media, you either don't have a camera or the camera is in control of the person playing it. So a type of shot that can be really useful is an insert shot. Now, I have to explain this image a little bit because it's kind of confusing. If you were watching The Big Lebowski, and there's a lot of Coen brothers in this lecture apparently, if you're watching The Big Lebowski, there is no scene in The Big Lebowski where, little things like those things on the left side of the screen appear as though, you're watching the news. Those are just examples of insert shots in the movie. And the bigger part of this picture is like how an insert shot is set up. So basically, in the movie, you'll have the dude played by Jeff Bridges, like pick something up, and then maybe he'll like unwrap it, like in the case of this thing that's in this cotton, right? So he's unwrapping it, and then you get what's called an insert shot that shows you what he finds. So in this case, it's the contents of the gauze wrapping, which is a toe. There's like a ransom note at one point, and then there's like a German new wave album. I don't think it's new wave, but there's like there's a record. So there's a lot of these shots where the dude picks something up, looks at it kind of puzzled, and then you get the insert shot of what it is. And so it's a shot put into a scene to show the audience a specific piece of information. In this case, what the dude is holding or what the dude finds. It's, again, often a still shot. A popular one in older movies, if you ever watch White Christmas during the holiday season, you might see this older, type of insert shot that was done a lot in movies in like the 40s and 50s, where a character will be like, I just got a letter from so-and-so. And then they will open the letter, and then there will be a matte painting of a hand holding a letter. And the idea is that the audience member, you as the audience member, reads the letter. That's not done anymore. Usually they'll just be like, I got a ransom note, and then they'll show you the ransom note, and then they'll insert shot the ransom note, and then the character they'll shoot back to the character, who will then be like, have $500,000 to me by Tuesday. They'll read the note out loud. But insert shot used to be like they would do that with like letters and stuff like that too, such that the viewer would read them. But they were such a still shot that they would even do them just as matte paintings, not as like, all right, Bing, hold this note for 30 seconds perfectly still. They wouldn't do that. Do you know any animated features that are known for their cinematography? Features? I mean, The Lion King. I think Pixar generally does a good job with its cinematography. Like, without being somebody who, like I said, I'm not in animation as like, feature length type animation, such that I'm reading their film language a lot. So I couldn't be like, this one is the best. But I can tell you like ones that I think generally are very, Disney and Pixar are generally very good. Trying to like figure out, Ghibli I think does a really excellent job. So I can more think of like studios who generally have good cinematography than like, oh, but that one. But I would say like those are my two go-tos. I'm trying to like think of, is there there was an article, it's not an animated feature, but there was an article about Akira Toriyama's comics work, like the manga of Dragon Ball. And some of that does carry over to the cartoons and movies of Dragon Ball, but I generally think that those are not as good as the layout work for the fight scenes if you ever pick up like Dragon Ball manga, especially the older Dragon Ball manga. The way he composes fights is like a textbook of those. But in terms of like super duper inventive stuff, that's just not my area of expertise, such that I can be like, yes, go watch this list of 6 of them. Yeah, no problem. So here's an example of an insert shot, and it's kind of a long shot, like series of shots here, kind of a long scene here, so forgive me. But in Return of the Jedi, when Luke is in the Rancor pit, they do this thing where he's looking panicked, and then he looks off camera and like right there, and then you see the switch for the door, and then he throws the skull at the switch, and then that makes the door come down. So that's an insert shot, because you're kind of scared for Luke, and then he looks like he's momentarily hopeful, and he looks off camera, and then you see the button. That is what I mean when I say an insert shot. So yeah, insert shot, Rancor, go splat. Sometimes you get a cutaway, so it's shots that cut away from the main action to show something happening in the same place or in the same conversation at the same time. So, in this scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ferris is calling the school to be like, I don't feel well, I'm staying home. And Principal Rooney doesn't believe him. And so it cuts away from Ferris to Principal Rooney to show Principal Rooney's emotional reaction to Ferris's shenanigans. Because as people who've watched this movie know, he has been absent this semester alone 9 times. And Rooney is out to get him. So, this is good for character reaction. So this is like if you have multiple characters in a room and 2 characters are fighting and one character is off to the side and like gasps. That's a cutaway. And that they are in the same scene or context is very important, because we'll see ones where you cut between 2 different things. Real quick, content warning for the next one. If you don't like, I would say, light gore, you're not going to like this, so divert your eyes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So cut on the action is a method for when you want to have, like, if there's an action happening, but you don't want to show part of it, and it's 9 times out of 10 used for violence. So in this case, you have, in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you have the scene where Indy is fighting the big Nazi guy, and, they're fighting under the airplane, and the airplane turns on. And, so the airplane is going around, the propellers are going around, and Indy is, like, on the ground, but then he like, ducks. And the big guy, Indy notices that the propeller is coming. The big guy doesn't see it. Indy curls up to take cover, and the big guy's like, what's going on? Realizes something's up, but it's too late. And then he is, he's, like, smushed. Now, for both budget and taste reasons, you don't show the smushing, but you have a cut on the action to a blood splatter, and that gives you a sense of what's happened. And similarly, the book uses the example of, in a Western movie, if you're having a character get hanged, you're going to have the executioner put the noose around the guy. You're going to show the guy's face. You're going to maybe show, the trap door fall out. And then you'd cut on the action to the rope, and you'd show the rope go taut. And then you'd have a long shot of the gallows showing, like the body being hanged without any detail. But what that does is it avoids you having to watch a person get hanged. Same thing, you don't want to see a person get, like, disintegrated by this airplane propeller. So again, both for, like, budget and taste, because it's both gross, but also you'd have to create that special effect. So, cut on the action, that is when you do this kind of cut. Cross-cutting, now it's different from a cutaway. Cutaway is like if 2 characters are in the same room or on the phone with each other or something. Cross-cutting is when you are showing things happening at the same time, and you're cutting between them, but they're in different places and separated from each other. Now, this and some of the other shots might make you think, well, wait a minute, why does this work? Why does this not break continuity? The reason for that is because you have prepared the audience. It's like anticipation in animation. You've prepared the audience to expect this. So, here's an example from the movie Inception. This is like, and you see cross-cutting in a lot of Christopher Nolan movies, but also in a lot of heist movies. And to use the heist, and I mean, Inception is basically a heist movie, but in a heist movie, you always have the planning scene where the characters are like, all right, here's what's going to happen. And then George Clooney walks you through the whole thing, right? And you will get by having that scene that describes what's about to happen, then the cross cuts make sense because you're like, oh, now we're back with so-and-so and he's going to do this. So you have a context, like a mental map of what's going on and who's where and why. And then again, of course, you can even cross-cut this with the narration during the plotting, where the cross-cutting happens during George Clooney telling you how they're going to get into the casino, right? So there's cross-cutting. If you just started cross-cutting with no build-up, it would be really confusing. But having in your story the all right, here's what we're going to do scene lets you get away with cross-cutting. And again, you can see where somebody would have made this and people would have been like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. You also get cross-cutting in a lot of battle scenes where you maybe have one character is with the cavalry and another character is in the fort and another character is fighting, like Return of the King. You would cross-cut between Gandalf and Pippin and the Rohirrim and Aragorn and the orcs, right? You can do that kind of cross-cutting, and it all takes place around Minas Tirith. So these types of transitions are useful when you have very big set pieces, or when you have, again, these sort of heist things happening where there's a lot of moving parts. This is usually when you have again, a big, this is during the climax. Real quick, some simple types of transitions. Cross dissolve basically have two scenes that dissolve into one another. So it's like a crossfade. Fade to black, fade to white. Those are pretty self-explanatory. One that you should know the name of is the iris in, which shows a circle focusing in on a character or object, and the rest of the scene is black. So that's what this is an iris in. I don't know why it goes in reverse, but you can have it as a fade in or fade out type thing. But iris ins are popular also in old cartoons, where you'd have the iris in happen at the end on Bugs Bunny's face, and he'd be like, "Ain't I a stinker?" and then it would finish the iris in. So, but that's what that's called. There's not really much more to that than that. Another one is called a match cut, which is where you transition between two shots that are similar in composition, whether that be that they have literal visual elements that are the same, as in the case of this one from the movie The Fall. The textbook uses an example of one where maybe you have a character in a basement and the shot ends, the scene in the basement ends on a shot of the light in a basement that is just a hanging light, like a hanging light bulb, and then it crossfades with, now you're outside in the sun and the sun is in the position in the shot where the light bulb was. That's a match cut. The other thing that they talk about with the match cut is if you have a character eating and you have a longer shot of the character picking up some cereal with their spoon, and then a closer shot of the character putting the spoon in their mouth, that's a match cut because it's the same thing but from a different angle. And then jump cuts. So this one is kind of interesting to me because the rule I was given for jump cuts. Now, I didn't go to film school. I went to architecture school. But I had a digital media concentration, and what that meant was that we did a lot of walkthrough renders for things in 3D Studio Max. Where this gets to jump cuts is that a rule I was given, and I think it applies to jump cuts to a degree is that you want to show the most interesting stuff. And for example, I had a project once where I designed a house and I had a staircase as the entry to the house, and the walkthrough animation would take the person viewing it up the staircase. Now, when you are going up the staircase for like the second or two or three that you're walking up the staircase, the viewer would see wall and stairs for a while, for that like 2 to 3 seconds. And that's kind of wasted time. It's wasted time because if your goal of such an animation is to show people their cool house, showing them drywall for 2 to 3 seconds is not interesting. So I was given the piece of advice where it's like, well, show them getting to the stairs and about to go up, and then crossfade that with now you've reached the top of the stairs and you're turning into the main living space, which is like the point of the animation, right? And that's a jump cut, because what you do when you're doing a jump cut is if there's something that takes a long time, you can jump cut through it. So here's a scene from the movie The Royal Tenenbaums by Wes Anderson, and it's of Luke Wilson's character, Luke Wilson. Owen Wilson is wow. But it's Luke Wilson's character cutting his hair, right, at the mirror. So rather than like show Luke Wilson for like however long it's going to take him to cut his hair, instead of showing him going through the whole process, it's going to jump cut through it, and then you see like snaps to different like levels of hair cuttedness over time. Jump cuts are also used if you want to convey boredom. They're useful for, if you have like a character waiting for a bus, the character is going to sit at the bus stop, and maybe they get there in the morning, and then it jump cuts to later in the morning, and the character is slouched a little bit, and then it jump cuts, and the character is more slouched, maybe looking a little either worried or irritated. Then maybe it jump cuts, and it's mid-afternoon, and they're asleep, and then it does another jump cut, and they're like super slouchy, and it's night, and then that's when they like get up and try to be like, hey, where's my friend's bus or something like that. And that's where, jump cuts are useful for showing, again, sort of long, tedious things. I got a question in the last class, would you ever use a jump cut for fast action? And the reason you would not probably use a jump cut for fast action is that by jumping through something that would not take very long, you actually would probably make it harder to read. And fight scenes and other fast actions should be given, like, you want to make them as clear as possible because they are tough to keep straight. You want to make them really, really legible. So real quick, let's talk about different camera movements, and then after that we can do questions. So camera moves include zoom, which is increasing the size of an image to focus on something. So zoom is the equivalent of like if you're holding a camera, you twist the lens such that it zooms in on the thing. Dollying or trucking, I've heard it called both, and if I'm getting that wrong, I apologize, but in my experience, I've heard it called either or. But that's the process of, let's say you have two different scenes, right? And you want to focus on a character's face. Again, zooming in on a character is taking that camera and turning the lens such that you zoom. You use the zoom function of the camera. The equivalent would be is if you increase the size of an image in like on a computer. To dolly or truck is to physically move the camera towards the subject such that, other things in the scene would position and shift according to perspective. And and that's why it's called dollying or trucking, is because you are putting the camera on a dolly and physically moving as opposed to just like zooming in with the camera's zoom function. So those are two GIFs of those functions occurring. Another thing that it's not in your textbook, but I think it's useful to know because it's actually kind of a good cheat sometimes. And we had to do this a lot with architectural renderings, is using what's called the Ken Burns effect, which is panning across a still image to create the impression of motion. So what that would be is you would take a still image like in like this engraving of a battle in the Civil War or an archival photo, and you would zoom into part of it, and then you would pan across it. And by doing that, instead of leaving it still, you imply motion where there is no motion. And it's called the Ken Burns effect because it's famously used by documentary filmmaker Ken Burns with archival photos and images, especially in his documentary Ken Burns Civil War, to the point where like I can hear this GIF. I can hear the dun 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 dun. So that's a useful thing if you do have a still image and you want to get some motion out of it. You can do that. It's a useful little trick. So if you're making your storyboards and you want to post on them like the camera movements you want, or your storyboards or your animatics, there are notations that are usually accepted. At the same time, like people use what they're going to use, but if there is something close to like a textbook version, if you're going to pan, which is like shift the camera back and forth, like to one side or another, you indicate that with arrows, like you can see in the upper left corner. If you're zooming in or zooming out, you have that with arrows at the edges. Now that's like an even zoom in or out. In a second I'll show you what it would look like if you're trying to communicate zooming in on an object or a character. Same thing with tilting up. You have these curved arrows tilting up or down, and then you might do something with rotation as well. I'm not going to focus on these too much just because, again, there's different languages, as you can see here, for communicating the same effect. So if you're trucking in or zooming in on a character here, like with this guitar player, and zooming and trucking are two different things, but like just for the sake of argument, you might draw these the same way. So if you start a scene and it's zoomed out of this character with a guitar, it would be the whole scene, like the whole frame here. But then if you were going to truck or zoom in on the character's face, you might notate it like that. Same with trucking out. And see, here's another pan that is a different way to show panning, where you like pan between two shots. And then at the bottom, there's even another version of pan where you draw the whole, like you draw the environment, and then you have like shot 1 in red and shot 2 in red, and then you draw an arrow panning between the two. So there's lots of different ways to do this. Don't take this as like, here is the textbook way and I will grade you with an F if you don't do it. It's more of like, here's a few different versions of this visual language that you can use to communicate the same idea. And of course, if you do an animatic, you will enact, doing an animatic is actually creating. So this is a lot of cuts. So there's not a lot of panning in this animatic, but like these are a lot of cuts. But, in an animatic, you would just draw the, you would actually like have the panning and cutting and all these transitions happen. That's part of the point of an animatic, is to draft out, like make a draft version of the film cutting as it would, being edited as it would, except it's with drawings instead of animation. And again, that's what you're doing for your final. And then the last thing is staging, which is how do you position things on the screen such that the viewer is able to read them. And again, based on the previous question, games do this too. They do it in different ways because you are dealing with an open-ended environment. So staging is often done through the way the environment's designed rather than the way the shot is laid out. But you can use the environment to create cinematography like staging. So this is a good example of staging in a movie from the movie Ice Age. You have Scrat, and he is on an ice floe, and he sees his acorn, which is on another ice floe. And the problem, the thing keeping him from his beloved acorn, is that the ice floe has split, and he is going to float away from it. So, we know that Scrat is our main character because there he is the character on the screen. We know that his focus is on the acorn because he is looking directly at the acorn. We know that this is a emotional thing for him because of his body language and posing. And we know the problem is scaring him because, again, we know what the problem is because we see that there is a gulf between him and the acorn. So this is good staging because it gives you the entire sense of the conflict of the scene and the story of the scene. It's a very simple story, but that's the point. It's easy to understand. Now, if we take a look at this scene from The Empire Strikes Back, one of the things that I hope you understand with all of this is that nothing is random. Everything is plotted out. So, when they're filming this scene where Princess Leia is giving orders to the rebel pilots to defend the transports, it's not like they told a bunch of people in their costumes oh yeah, just go stand next to this X-wing and then and say your lines and we're gonna we'll see how it comes out. They very discreetly positioned Leia and the pilots in specific ways to focus attention on Carrie Fisher. So, for example, let's talk about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is where you compose your shot in thirds, horizontally and vertically, such that it is more interesting. It's less interesting when something is centered. So here we have storyboards from SpongeBob, and if we have Mr. Krabs at his there's a reason to have something centered. It's usually if you're trying to emphasize that thing being centered. So maybe a holy person or a god or, some sort of doorway, that's a reason to do the sort of centered symmetrical shot. But Mr. Krabs at his desk, unless you're trying to make him seem intimidating, you're probably not going to do that. It's flat and boring to do that. But see, on the right side, that same context, but drawn such that Mr. Krabs is on on a third and SpongeBob is on a third, is a more interesting composition. Same thing with below that with Squidward and SpongeBob. They're on thirds. Their backdrop is a nice dynamic perspective. Squidward is centered, but the whole scene is off center. That is good. That is good dynamic layout and staging. So if we go back to Princess Leia, by not being centered and by having important parts of the scene laid out in the thirds of the scene, that creates a more interesting dynamic layout that could have been very boring if you just put her smack in the center and had it be very static. And this is the run up to a scary battle, so you don't want it to be static. You want it to feel a little chaotic and a little slapdash, okay, get together, now go. So they're all they're composed in thirds, but not all centered. So that gives more dynamism to the scene. So again, we are focusing our attention on Carrie Fisher in this scene, and how do we do that? Well, she's close to the center, but she's not in the center, again, giving her some dynamism. we are also framing her between two rebel pilots. So those guys did not just happen to stand next to the camera or close to the camera. It's that you put you put stuff around your main point of view to frame that so that the viewer's eye is drawn to the thing that you are framing. So between the two foreground rebel pilots is Princess Leia, and then that again draws your attention to Princess Leia. The other thing that draws your attention to her is that she is brighter than other characters. There is less shadow on her. She has a white outfit where everybody else has orange outfits. And then you could even say that she's also framed on the top by the X-Wing's wing. But, you get a sense of framing that's focusing your attention further on her. And then, finally, everybody's looking at her because she is commanding them. So that gives you further emphasis on that one character. Now, could you have had the attention on her with just one of these things? Yes. But it's more effective when you pile these things up. And again, it's like I've talked about with game design, when you indicate something to the player, you think you've done it, you think you've indicated it because you have two things, but you really need 3 or 4 things, like throw a sound and another particle effect or a color change on it or something. Having more indicators does a better job of directing the attention the way you want that to be directed. And then the last slide before I take questions is, so here's another example from Ratatouille. Here's a really good scene where, Remy is like, well, how am I going to cook these things? So he's thinking about it, and it's really clever because he's in the right third of the screen, and the house is in the back, or is in the other 2/3 of the screen. So you get him thinking about it, and then the focus shifts to the chimney. And you don't really need to change the shot very much, because of the way it's laid out. You have him thinking about how he's going to do this, and then the focus shifts to the chimney and then back to Remy, and that gives you the context without really needing as much dialogue. It's not like the bad way to do this would have been to have this occur and then have a narrator come in and be like, and then Remy looked at the chimney and he had a thought. That's like the storybook version, but you don't want that. You want to use film techniques. So that's why it's good to have, you've set the table by having these things on the thirds, and then you shift the focus between the two of them in such a way that it does your storytelling for you, where you shift focus, then Remy looks at the chimney and then turns back and is like, I got it, right? And again, you don't have, Remy saying like, I'm thinking about that chimney looks promising. It's done without the dialogue. And that's, again, the power of this sort of storytelling. So, ask me 2 questions. It looks like there's only one person left. So I'll be available on Discord if anybody needs it. So otherwise, I will talk to you all later.